There's been a gap between when I recorded this footage of the screen and me doing the current audio overdub, and now I'm not sure in retrospect if I've chosen the best approach for this, but I'm not going to re-record anything, so we will just need to make the best of it. In line with the previous videos in the series, I wanted to do this layout in isolation and then assemble it with the other subcomponents, so I'm commenting out my previous work so that I've got kind of like a blank canvas to work on. But actually, having narrated the last video about the finished CTA, the plan and the card components, it might have made more sense for me to keep those on screen and work with them in situ. What I thought was valuable about this approach was that I was adding these empty divs which are designed to house the CTA and plan components, and I was marking those as slots in my BEM, my BEM naming scheme, because that's the terminology that is used by Vue and by Svelte and by web components actually, for these areas where your component doesn't really necessarily know what it's wrapping around. It could be a single component, or it could be a composition of some kind, or it could just be some arbitrary HTML. The point, for this demonstration at least, is that a piece of content that we pull into one of these slots might control its own font sizes and its own hover states and some internal layout between mobile and desktop views, but it does not control the things that are relevant to the layout of the overall order component. The annual plan and the CTA don't have any padding or margin at their borders that acts as white space in the overall design, because we can't anticipate what white space might be required in a particular context or combination where they might be used. Never mind how that spacing and positioning is supposed to work across different viewport breakpoints. And for the same reason, we don't want to hard-code widths or even maximum widths on these things, because you might want buttons side by side on a desktop view but stacked across the full width of a mobile client. Now, I'm conscious that I'm chattering away here in the background about how these components are supposed to behave in the abstract, and it's got nothing to do with what's happening on the screen, which is just me taking this layout component and trying to get the basic styles right for the heading, get the size of the font heading right, and the text, get the line spacing of the paragraph, and so on and so forth. And then the first thing of note maybe that I do is, after I've put some basic padding around the element as a whole, the component as a whole, I go in and I use the gap property, which is relatively new to Flexbox. You can just add gap and that will give you a standard gap between the flex items within that flex parent, which you can see there, and then that appears on the right hand side, and then we'll just check that and you can see there's the standard 24 gap between those items. Now I think I go in and just strip off the margin from some of those elements so that I can directly control exactly the space between them. And then I use the align items flexbox property to center those items horizontally. Now I'm going to speed things up again because it's just more standard styling stuff until we get to media query for the layout component, which is going to control the padding for desktop and mobile versions. I hope you'll forgive me speeding through this section because I just can't bear to look at this anymore. I can't bear to watch myself fumbling about in this video, to chop this stuff up, or to narrate the adding of really stuff that should be obvious by now. It's a media query. I change the padding, I change the gap size in the flex gap property, and that just controls the gap between the items and the gap around the layout component between mobile and desktop. So speed on, speed on, speed on. Oh, except maybe I'll stop here just for a second because this speaks directly to what I was talking about earlier. The width of the annual plan component and the CTA are constrained here by the slot, just to the maximum content that they can fit. So I've had to go in and put the order summary layout slot, give that a width of 100% so that that is then where I am controlling the width of everything that's internal to that. So that's me being explicit about the layout, but using the slot wrapper around those components rather than baking those qualities into the component themselves. And this is where I go to test that. So I can go to my mobile view in DevTools, go to my desktop view, just expand that out to over the 500 pixel breakpoint. And then this is what we want to see, isn't it? Because we want that whole component to just stretch as wide as it's going to stretch and not be constrained by anything internal to that component. So by the same token, if we then uncomment the card component, which we've still got in there in the markup, we move that to the top so it's wrapping everything else that contains it. We see we've got the card now, and it wraps the plan and the CTA. And when we move on to a larger screen and sort of move the viewpoint around, we can see that the whole thing behaves in unison, obeying all of the rules that we have put upon it, saying let's stretch out as far as we can go, and every item has its own media it has its own media queries and its own breakpoints to control where things get larger and smaller, and we just need to put one more level of external control around this, which is going to be the background